Look, we're at 6:05, and I know everyone's time is really precious. And while we've more people registered, we are recording the event as well. And I know some people that have registered couldn't make it and are asking to be sent the recording. So I think let's just start. And, you know, as it's a roundtable event, so maybe it's just as well there's a smaller number that we can really, you know, do some brainstorming. Obviously, we all know why we're here, the abortion legislation, 3 years since repeal. It's up for review this year. And, you know, we sort of arranged as Just Transition Greens, arranged the event really just to get a sense of where we are, get some views on the existing legislation, what's needed from the review, and what we can do as a left feminist group, what we can do to assist the great civil society groups that are out there in moving towards this first review. And we have our official experts are Helen from ARC, Ailbhe, we all know Ailbhe, I think, is a great feminist and campaigner and activist, and Karen from Together for Safety, the national campaign for the safe access zones. And we're delighted to have Nasa Harrigan, TD and Just Transition Green member, joining us as well, give a really valuable insight from the Dáil perspective. And just a shout out to Mary Gallagher, who actually arranged all this thing. I'm just sitting in the chair tonight. So look, we've a few questions, and let's start off just sort of with the first question that we had and we sent out. And the first one was, since repealing the 8th, I suppose, what has actually worked with the new legislation for people who need abortion? And, you know, what isn't working in sense of what is critical to resolve in this review. So what is working, do we think? Helen, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, I must admit, when I was like, oh, I'll try and come up with at least 3 things that are working. I could only come up with 2, and I feel terrible for that. So I really hope Ailbhe's come up with something else that's working really well. I think when people know they need an abortion and they live near a GP that will provide, or near a reproductive health clinic that will provide, and they don't have any massive either underlying conditions or significant issues, they can walk in and get sorted. So I think for a lot of people in very typical situations, if you will, it is a very easy process. And I think when the GP process is working, it's working brilliantly. I think that's what we hear. We just did a piece of research, and for a lot of people, it is working quite well. And the other thing that really sticks out to me is working quite well is telemedicine, which has only come in since COVID, but it has made a huge difference, I think, for people being able to access, particularly in areas in the country where there isn't a huge amount of coverage. It means it doesn't matter if you talk to a doctor who's down in Cork and you're in Kerry or whatever. Do you know, it makes that easier. And it also mitigates the risk, the issues with the 3-day waiting period, for example, because you can have one appointment remotely and looking at less time off work, all of these kind of things. So those are the things that I had that were working quite well. In a lot of ways, GP access kind of, which is, again, that's under 10 weeks. So that's up to 9 weeks and 6 days, is working quite well where it's working and where it's there. And I hate to say, but what needs to change is basically everything else. I could give you a laundry list, and I'm going to try not to just ramble. But so access post 12 weeks. So if you look at the numbers that are coming out, we're getting roughly the same number of people accessing for risk to life or risk to health as we were under the 8th Amendment under the PLDPA, which is just, considering these are broader access grounds, that makes basically no sense. Abortions in hospitals aren't working brilliantly. We've only got about half of our hospitals are providing. And from the research that we've done into people's experiences, those experiences in hospitals are overwhelmingly negative. They're not particularly, I suppose, pleasant experiences. They're not necessarily being treated particularly well by staff. It's not being managed particularly well. Our abortion law is still criminalized outside of those bounds. It is still very difficult to get an abortion after 12 weeks. We have a 3-day waiting period. I could go on, and I'm not going to, because I would be here for about 2 hours telling you all the issues that exist, if that makes sense.
Thanks, Helen. So kind of the take-home message from your point of view is where it's being provided from GPs, it's working.
Yeah.
It's working okay. Karen, did you want to add to that?
No, actually. Helen is the expert in that, and I would just only be repeating what she said, really. The pieces that are working well. The piece that I would do on the ground is working very, very closely with students. So I would see students less often in less distress is where I would, but they would be more often than not, they would be your typical service user, in that there aren't any of the extenuating circumstances that cause all of the distress and all of the problems. So yeah, when it works well.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Ailbhe.
Yeah, no, I would absolutely agree. And Helen, I don't have good things to come up with about the law. Who does? I mean, I agree absolutely with the points both of you have made. I mean, I suppose what I would say is that looking back over the past 3 years, that what we understand very clearly, we did understand from the beginning that the law was inadequate, that it was full of deficits, that it was highly problematic, and many of us actually believe there shouldn't be a law at all anyway. But once we accept that there is a law, that there are a lot of problems with it, and I suppose we can say that there is at least a 3-year review which has to take place. It's a statutory requirement, and that there is some attention being paid to the nature of that review. And I would say that when we did actually ask the minister, which you both remember, and all of you, to ensure that there would be an independent expert leading the review, he has accepted that. Now, I don't know that he's gone any further than that. I haven't heard about that, because we had also said that the person needed to be a specialist reproductive rights and equality-based healthcare expert. So we haven't got that far. The other two things I would say, though, about it that mean that we really do have something positive to think about is that over 6,500 women did actually succeed in 2019 in accessing abortion in this country. And I remember, a few months ago, somebody said to me, it's been a complete failure. But I'm saying, no, hold on a minute. The law is not okay by a long shot, but to call it a complete failure is simply silly. We know that there were 6,500 women who accessed abortion under the 9-week periods, 98% of abortions. So that is good. And it's also really good for women that they're accessing abortion early. That's exactly the way it's supposed to work, and to be completely unremarkable and so on. And the other thing then is that there has been constant pressure on the HSE to keep looking at the provision, which is frankly, once you, as you quite rightly say, Helen, and also Karen, once you move past the number of GPs who are successfully offering it, and you look at the hospital sector, it's an absolute nightmare. And also a disgrace. It's a disgrace, actually. So, those are the problematic areas. But the HSE is very aware of that, and it did commission basically that research from Catherine Conlon in Trinity, which is now being done, and she's coming out with all of these very interesting findings. It's basically their research. They commissioned it. They're going to have to pay attention to it. And we've had a really, really, really good World Health Organization, sorry, I think that's my phone, piece of research as well. So, we have a huge amount of work to do now. And we can, Helen, you have your list, Karen, you have here's my list of all the things that need to change in the law. And there's another page of it as well. And then there's another one about the ancillary things and so on and so forth. But we're also very determined. And the last good thing I would say is that we are still working together as an abortion working group. And who would have thought that after a peer? So I'd say clap, clap, that's still going on.
I know after that, we might not all have wanted to speak to each other or see each other's faces all again. And I think we should consider it a great blessing that we're all still talking.
Exactly. And that we understand the importance of that unified approach at times, while we all go off and do whatever it is we want to be doing, but that's still working. And the important thing is that I think the minister does know that we are a key stakeholder to ensure that the experiences of women are written in front and centre to any review of the legislation.
I hope that's the case. Do you think, just on the last point, Ailbhe, there, that you're saying, that we're sort of, the activists are still working together, do you think a lot of people are aware that there is still, the war hasn't been won, that we may have won the battle 3 years ago, and that there's still another uphill battle?
No, of course not. I mean, people love victories and they like to think that victories are endpoints. But those of us who've ever campaigned for anything in our lives know perfectly well that a victory is generally a starting point, because that's when you move into looking at how policy needs to be developed and implemented, how services need to be developed, funded and implemented. And as we also very, very well know, there's a great deal wrong with our maternal and reproductive health services in any case. And that's even before we begin to address the massive catastrophe that is our health service as a whole.
No,
so,
absolutely.
But I don't blame people for thinking it's kind of done and dusted. And in a way, it's up to us from time to time to, shake the chain or something and say, listen, get up, all of you out there, as we will be doing outside the Dáil on Saturday, the 25th. I always, to remind ourselves, but everybody out there, that we, and particularly with abortion, it's, you're always working on it. And I just thinking, looking across Europe, that is so true. You think you've won something, it's not enough, it's not enough. And then they go and take away, or they put in place something else. It is a constant battle, because fundamentally that patriarchal control of women primarily goes through our bodies, our reproducing and our sexual bodies. That's what we really have to be tackling that's what we are really tackling fundamentally.
No, exactly. Does anybody want to comment before we move on? I don't see any hands. Just moving on then, sort of segueing into...
Sorry, that wasn't a very helpful note, maybe.
No, I'm just thinking, because you were saying about the list, you have the list of things and you've all got your lists of stuff. And really the next question is, what are the specific areas we need to work on, or that we want to see attention given to during the review? And I suppose the follow-on question is, what are the impacts to pregnant people if this isn't addressed during this review at the moment? Helen, did you want to jump off there?
Sure. I mean, again, I'm going to try not to talk 2 hours about it.
No, go ahead.
So I think I think a lot of people don't remember or realize this, but abortion is still a criminal offence under the Act. And so abortion needs to be fully decriminalised. So right now, a person is not criminalised with respect to their own abortion if they have an abortion outside of the Act. But if anyone helps in any way, or if a doctor provides an abortion outside of the Act, then they are subject to a 14-year criminal penalty. And we know from speaking to people and from speaking to doctors that because the grounds after 12 weeks are so tight, and because there is that criminal penalty, doctors are quite afraid or rather they're interpreting the law conservatively in order to protect themselves, which is understandable. But on the other hand, it means that people don't have access to care. And that's why we're seeing a lot of people still traveling. So those risk to health, risk to life, and fatal fetal abnormality grounds are being interpreted very conservatively because of that criminalization. But it also does mean it's kind of important to remember that if I had a friend who needed an abortion under 12 weeks and I ordered pills from them on the internet, that's also a 14-year prison sentence if I get caught for that. So it's not just, it wouldn't be my friend taking the pills, but if I was like, oh, I know where to get them and I sent them to her, that's me subject to that as well. So it's not just doctors, it's also, if you ordered it for a teenager or whatever. The 3-day wait, I already mentioned, it's just that extra barrier. We conducted some research ourselves, and I'll put the link to the event in the chat, although I think Mary probably has it somewhere. And a lot of people find that is just another wait on top of another wait on top of another wait. If you've got to get a doctor's appointment, you call your GP can't see you till Tuesday anyway. You wait until Tuesday. There was one woman who was talking about, every single little thing. She then had to wait for a scan. She had to wait for this. People are showing up to get, when someone wants their abortion, they go and get it as soon as they can. But we've got lots of little things in that just make it harder and harder and harder and push people later and later. We want, and as the Abortion Rights Campaign, as we've wanted for a long time, on request access throughout pregnancy. I don't want grounds-based access after 12 weeks. I don't think there's any situation in which someone should have to come up with a reason in order to not be pregnant anymore. I don't. And that's, there's no situation in which I would force someone to remain pregnant. And so that ultimately, if you have grounds-based access, sooner or later, you're going to have someone where they go, nope, but not you. And you're forcing someone, I'm going to let Karen talk about safe access zones because I know it's her special subject.
Karen.
Yes, and actually it's my life is so much easier than yours, Helen, I guess, at these things, because you've got all the things and I've just got the one specific thing, so I feel very lucky when I come to these things. And I suppose just to pick up on the point that Ailbhe made, our space is the general space of the infringement of rights of women and pregnant people. It's that larger space, and the specific space then of the safe access zones. I guess I look at it with my psychotherapy hat on quite a lot, because what we're seeing at the moment across a number of issues is the trivialization of women's distress and pregnant people's distress. And we're seeing this in a number of ways. I mean, obviously with the protests, which I'll talk about in a minute, but there's also the trivialization of pregnant people's distress in hospitals when they're forced to labour without their partners and on their own. And, I've been doing interviews, and the interviewer will say, oh, well, that's a separate thing, but actually it's not a separate thing. I would see it as absolutely the same thing. So we've got a situation whereby pregnant people are having to walk in Limerick, for example, walk into the maternity hospital on their own past the protesters, and then go in and labour on their own again. And we're hearing very distressing stories coming from the hospitals, all of them about people crying out for partners and so on. So it's therapeutically, what we're missing is the awareness of the impact of distress and trauma on the outcome of pregnant people's labour, for example, attachment with the baby's health outcomes, the parents' health outcomes, relational stuff. And I would do a lot of work with people who have postnatal depression. Postnatal depression is heightened among people who've got traumatic birth experiences. So there's a huge knock-on element here, highly correlated with each other, that just isn't being explored. So there's I could talk forever about the details of the protests, and they're outside the GPs and the family planning clinics and the hospitals, and they're distressing and so on. And also there's a lot, we're doing a lot of work with organizations like the in the disability sector, in the intimate partner violence sector, and so on. And what we're hearing back from the various groups is the specific impact of trauma on the people that they are representing. So people with disabilities, people who are coming from situations of violence and unsafety, and the exceptional lack of unsafety that comes to them then when they must walk past protesters to give birth on their own, worrying, or to even access any kind of health appointment on their own, worrying if they have been videoed, photographed, are they going to be on social media, is their privacy going to be violated, and so on. I'm not sure, I've actually forgotten. I've forgotten what the question was, and I don't know if I answered it.
No, you did.
No, you did in spades. And it's the lack of centering of women in their healthcare. Like, I think that's the nub of what you're describing there.
And just to add, and I'm certain that you guys probably felt the same, but I think my hair, I spent all of yesterday with my hair on fire because I was watching Minister Donnelly talking about women's healthcare being centred and it being all over the news, and I really don't think I was able to sit down for the whole day because I was fueled entirely by rage. And it is that because there are so many instances where women's health is absolutely not centre, not even centre, it's 4 miles off to the edge and brought in as an afterthought. So I think that anything that I would say about the safe access zones really is in that space of the larger piece of women's health just being an afterthought.
I could just come in and circle back on a couple of those. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. But one of the things that we did ask Minister Donnelly for is to ensure, because we haven't any of us seen the terms of reference yet of the review group. So, I think when you were asking about what will need to be done at that moment, Lourdes, there will have to be a big swing into action, because trust me, they are not going to be satisfactory, these terms of reference. But one of the things that we requested, among others, is that the review should focus on, obviously, the operation of the TOP, the operation of the bill, but also on the sort of what you might call the parameters of the legal framework. And that would include other legislative measures that need to be adopted, including safe access zones and free contraception, which now the Minister seems to have committed to, although we don't have a date for that yet. And apparently safe access zones are in process, but we don't yet have the detail, and so on and so forth. And also practice. So therefore service provision. And I mean, there is at the back of my mind an issue because your access to abortion in this country, because it's community-based and because only something like 400 GPs are actually effectively offering the service, it means, and because only 11 of the 19 maternity hospitals are doing so, you really are looking at enormous geographic gaps. It's, the famous postcode lottery. Depending on where you live, actually depends on the ease and rapidity of your access to abortion, because many GPs, as reported in the World Health Organization research, I think, have said that, it's difficult for them if there is not a maternity hospital within their locale which is offering full services. It's very difficult for them to refer. And each of the pieces of research that has been done in any case is pointing to the difficulty of referral pathways. But what's in the back of my mind somewhere, and I meant to talk to a lawyer, but of course I haven't, does the HSE not have any power of compulsion on hospitals which are funded by the state, by the public purse, to insist that those hospitals actually offer the full range, and that if they are lacking, as they say, in infrastructure or personnel, that this be made known, and that the normal channels of request, now maybe it's going to take 5 years or something, but they're not even asking at the moment. They're not even saying we don't have the infrastructure. They are simply not doing it. So, I think it's worth somebody somewhere following up to see what power, if any, the HSE and or the Department of Health, who are, of course, at loggerheads with one another as usual, but to see what exactly is the situation there, because it is disgraceful. Which also leads me to the point about conscientious objection. There is a conscientious objection clause in the law. I'm not necessarily against it, not necessarily for it. But what is there is very poor. And furthermore, there are absolutely no guidelines or procedures anywhere on how conscientious objection is to be operated and implemented. And there was an absolutely shocking, blood-curdling quote in, I think it was WHO research, where a member of the medical personnel in one of the big maternity hospitals, now not necessarily the Dublin maternity hospitals, one of the maternity hospitals actually said, oh, well, of course it's a problem with conscientious objection here. 90% of the people here in this hospital are Catholic and are conscientious objectors. So, we are still dealing with the awful residue of this culture of Catholic culture, and that has to be tackled head on. It's no good the HSE saying, oh, the law says they have to do it. If they're not actually doing it, what are the ways that they can be compelled to do so? So conscientious objection, along with decriminalisation, is really, really important, and referral pathways and compelling hospitals to offer services. I hope that they will come within the remit of the review group. I think anything to do with services may not, in which case we will be looking at our excellent politicians to say, what can you do to put pressure on government to insist that there be a full-scale Department of Health inquiry into the extent of service provision and the gaps and deficits in service provision, which mean that abortion is only available in a very uneven, unfair, unjust way, and that, as we know, and as we saw again with the pandemic, it is those women who have least advantage, who have none, who are marginalised, who are already suffering extreme distress in their material lives. They're the ones who are carrying the brunt all the time.
Could I just pick up on something Ailbhe said there, which I obviously agree with every word, but there's so many pieces there, and one of the things that worries us very much in relation to the protests is that piece that Ailbhe said about the culture, the Catholic culture. So what we have been told by staff in the Limerick maternity is that the protesters only come on the days that there are termination of pregnancies taking place, which means that there are people in the hospitals communicating with the protesters. So that's the one piece. Another piece that, and one of there's so many pieces that I find absolutely abhorrent, but one of the pieces that I find particularly abhorrent are the hospitals, like for example Sligo, who have decided that they will only do certain types of terminations.
Yeah.
So for example, we know Sligo will only do, I think it's the TFMR terminations. This is absolutely abhorrent and absolutely based in shaming of women and old thinking around terminations. But what I would really like to know, and it's Ailbhe's point about compelling the HSE to do some research into this, who in each hospital decides what kind of a termination takes place? Which person makes that decision, and on what grounds, and on whose authority, given that I feel in 2018 we were very, very clear about what we voted for, and we were very clear about what we were told we would get. We certainly did not vote for individual hospital masters to decide the grounds on which I may request a termination. So those pieces are utterly abhorrent, but they speak to really an embedded Catholic ethos and an embedded shame-based rhetoric around women's reproductive issues and health and bodies.
So you only have to mention the three words National Maternity Hospital to get that point as well. Anyway,
got a whole other conversation. Just to really briefly pick up on that thing. So one of the participants in our research actually talks about how just that shame issue. A doctor was prepared to hand over the prescription, but first sat her down and talked about how abortion was terrible. She was going to regret it for the rest of her life. No one ever is happy after going through an abortion. You'll never love your children. Still handed her the pills, but just shamed her first and gave her this whole lecture. And there's no repercussions for that. There's no repercussions. As Ailbhe was saying, the conscientious objection part in the law, there's a huge amount of detail on in the law on review periods and if someone is refused and how they can claim and all of these things. There's lots and lots of details on procedures that I think are almost very rarely used. Very little detail on the punishment, but on the consequences for conscientious objection. It's much, much easier to object than it is to provide at the moment, and that should not be the case for any circumstances.
Absolutely. Yeah. There's also stuff around data collection, I think, too, isn't there, Helen? Yes. You might want to talk about that data. It's not my area really, but it does come in under the legislation, I think, doesn't it?
Yes, they're obliged to collect a certain amount of data. It's actually reasonably limited data, I suppose. It's when the abortion takes place, what grounds it takes place on, and where it takes place.
Yeah, we're not getting very, very good feedback at the moment.
No.
I mean, they just give the very blunt figures like 21 risk to life and health, 3 for emergency reasons, 100 for FFA. Well, that's kind of like a separate issue in a way. There are big problems under that I should have remembered for fatal fetal anomaly in terms of time limits, the 28-day time limit. If the death occurs before or in a period up to 28 days after birth, then is likely to occur in that period of time, then an abortion can technically be carried out if the hospital agrees, of course. But that 28 days doesn't make any sense medically, it would appear, because no doctor can say, well, it could be 29 days, it could be 3 months. It could be 2 days. It just does not work. It really doesn't work. And it is apparently, causing a lot of panic and pressure, with the result that so many women are still traveling. So many women and pregnant people are still traveling to the UK in cases of fetal anomaly, basically. And, that's even if the rate has decreased in Britain by something like 87%, it still means that about 350 women are traveling every year. And I'm sure a large proportion of those are women who have had a diagnosis of a fetal anomaly, not necessarily fatal. So again, that's a whole area which is very upsetting for people. And the law is going to have to that needs to be looked at in the review. I hope that will be changed, that there will be a kind of more flexibility around that, because it really, really should happen.
No,
it's definitely.
Absolutely. I'm just aware, I just have Rosanna has been waiting very patiently for a long time with a question. Rosanna,
sorry, we could talk about this all day.
No, it's okay. It's okay.
With loads of time.
So I have two small questions. Helen,
Yes.
The removal of grounds-based access, when does that kick in? Is that after 12 weeks? Or I should know this, I know.
So under 12 weeks, you don't need to have any reason to have an abortion. You can just walk in and say, I want an abortion. No one gets to ask you why, even though obviously sometimes they will, because Catholic shame that we were just talking about. After 12 weeks, and that's 12 weeks plus 0 days, then you either need to, there is grounds-based access. So you need to either have a serious risk to harm for your health. Someone help me out if I get the legislation wording wrong. Serious risk to life, or fetal diagnosis where they're likely to survive less than 28 days, as Ailbhe was saying. So those are the three things.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah.
Karen, I remember in the presentation by Mairead Enright, she gave a bunch of comparisons with how they're it worked in other countries. She made some specific comparisons, I think with Australia, was it, about the right to protest and navigating that area. Is that anywhere that we can read or follow up on? Not necessarily her presentation, but maybe some of the references that she talked about.
Well, actually, we still have the presentation. We have it in audio, and we have her permission to share it. So I would be delighted to send that on to you if you'd like.
Please share it with me.
Yeah,
I was there. I just couldn't write fast enough.
No,
pretty much like tonight.
But I mean, the comparisons that she drew on that night are really the basis for the draft legislation that we've put together. So it's that idea that people do have the right to protest, but they don't have the right to a captive audience, which is a very important piece. And we've been doing a lot of work with unions to make sure that the right to protest is front and center. And actually, we got really, really good feedback from the INMO. They were very happy with the legislation. They were very happy that it kept the right to protest front and center. So, we're getting excellent feedback. So there's really, we're slowly ticking off all the boxes of the things that people have said that they would have the problems with, and we're working with the various groups. So it's quite promising, but it all came from Mairead's excellent presentation that night.
It was so good, and I'm glad so many people heard it. There was a real kind of a diverse attendance. Okay, my last question, Dorita, is more of a general one. Just about conscientious objection. I've tried so hard to find more to read on this, and it's really hard to find. And like Ailbhe said, there's no guidelines, and it's in place for emergency contraception as well. And there's no guidelines from the pharmacy union or anything like that. And so it's just an open question, send me somewhere. What is there a comparative thing in other countries? I want to know more about conscientious objection, because unlike you, Ailbhe, I don't like it. I'm not okay with it.
I'm not even, I'm not arguing the point at all there, really. I accept absolutely that, it's not like Catholics for Choice in the US have done very interesting work on conscientious objection. So I can't give you a link off the top of my head, but I can, suggest you actually go to the Catholics for Choice website, and you certainly will get a thread there that will lead you to interesting things. I mean, I think it was partly through Catholics for Choice that I did have something of a rethink about, because I was an objector to conscientious objection clauses. And then it was actually a medical doctor actually who said to me, yeah, but do you really want to go for an abortion with the conscientious objector? And I said, oh God, no. I mean, I don't entirely take that point, but I think if there is going to be a clause on conscientious objection from a civil liberties perspective, it needs to be thought through very carefully. And it also needs to happen in a culture where there is an acceptance and an understanding of what conscientious objection is. And I don't think we have that here in this country, where, you know, everybody has just always done what the church said, basically. So there's a very limited understanding of and we haven't even a history of pacifism to the Second World War, for example. You know, there are lots of ways in which we don't have that kind of experience. So it's, I think that we need to really have, you know, much more of a discussion and a debate about what is meant by it. So it really shouldn't be in the legislation at the present time in any case. And it's clearly in Ireland, you know, we don't need conscientious objection in the law. It's happening on the ground, which is so disheartening.
Yeah.
Just a very quick follow-up. Do you think, does it need to happen in different areas for doctors and pharmacists? Does that need separate legislation, or does it kind of be dealt with in the same? So one, I suppose, is prescribing and one is over the counter.
Well, I'm not a legal expert. I think it could probably be dealt with, not at all. I mean, I imagine it can technically be dealt with in the same sort of clause, provided you specify the extent of the remit of the conscientious objection. So to what kinds of personnel does it actually apply? Just
on the point of how it works internationally, the one that always comes to my mind is Italy. Because they have, again, a reasonably strong Catholic culture. And I think it's the percentage of conscientious objections is ridiculously high. It's something like 80% of GPs don't provide because they are conscientiously objecting. And now, bearing in mind, that's actually not dissimilar to ourselves, like, do you know, and that we only have about 10% of our GPs to provide. So, but it's very, very difficult in Italy to get an abortion. There was a woman who died not that long ago, I believe it was 2017, I want to say, because she just literally could not access an abortion and she needed when she needed one. So people, it is a massive issue in other places. I'm with you, Rosanna. I don't like conscientious objection. I think that I understand it in perhaps a surgery procedure or something like that or whatever, but I think if you're handing over a pack of pills, I don't care. So it's just a personal opinion.
The UK Abortion Act has conscientious objection, I think. Right. Yeah, absolutely. But one of the problems there is not really with conscientious objection, but a problem which I think is cropping up in the Irish system as well, is that there are actually very few, there is a shortage of abortion providers, providing doctors in the hospital settings, which is one of the reasons, in fact, that they have clinics in the UK. So it is a different system, but they do actually have it in the Act. On the other hand, they also have a restrictive law in that you have to get a signature from 2 GPs, but from 2 doctors, but you can still get an abortion very easily. So there are cultural differences, I suppose. But I am not advancing an argument for conscientious objection.
No, I know.
I see Janet's hand up, and Nasa, I'm going to bring you in after Janet just with a couple of questions about the HSE and a little bit more maybe on the review group. Janet, do you want to go ahead first?
Thanks. Yeah, I guess my thought or question, or whichever way, is maybe a bit of the bigger picture element of it rather than the minutiae of the legislation, which is, I guess, for me, one of the major things that repeal did bring about 3 years ago was the cracking open of the conversation into a wider thing about women's health. And so yeah, this is the kind of bigger picture element of it. I'm kind of almost reluctant to consistently talk about abortion, because I think that there's such an opportunity to be talking about taking the chance and be talking about issues of menopause and endometriosis and maternal health care and all these kind of things that are such huge things that have been so neglected for so long. And because abortion was just this massive siren of injustice that sat there because it sat in the Constitution, we were forced to keep the conversation of women's health to the topic of abortion in a very kind of bounded kind of a way. And now it's like, okay, let's take this, let's bring it. It now sits within a wider context of women's healthcare as an just big picture, like endemic, systemic injustice of how women are treated in the country. So how, I guess, that's my thought on it. And then I guess my question is, my concern is that every time the abortion legislation comes up, it brings us back into the box of abortion and talking about it in a box, of which we have done for decades because we have to. And then how do we ensure that we are bringing it back to the wider issues of of women's healthcare across the board? And I totally appreciate that, as Karen was saying, that there's like these kind of, rhetoric that's coming out now about sort of how important it is, but obviously, you need to exist in a woman's body for about a day before you realize that there's serious issues with how the medical industry and the state deal with our healthcare. So and that is like a few bits of rhetoric isn't going to fix that. So yeah, I guess that's my question, is just kind of, with approaching this review of the abortion legislation, how do we ensure that we're dealing with it, and that is a more philosophical question probably, but how do we keep the focus on the big picture of women's health and not kind of let it continue to be boxed off in some way? Or should we let it, or maybe you may feel that it should be boxed, whichever way. Your thoughts?
I'm going to just ask Karen, because I know you have to leave in a few minutes. Karen, do you want to sort of jump in on the back of that question? And then it's a really good and important one as well, Janet.
Yeah.
Go ahead there, Karen. You're just muted.
Dear God, will I ever get it right? So thank you so much, Lorna. And Janet, that's a really superb question. And honestly, I'm gutted I have to go early, because I think that we could be here for several hours kind of unpicking that question. Talking about, do we, whether we want to make the discussion, the national discussion, about people's health rather than women's health, but then do we get forgotten in that, and so on and so on. And I guess, I have no immediate answer, except that I suspect that is the absolute right question that you're asking. And I think that, and I love spaces like this where people come together to really ask the questions, especially when there are no immediate answers. But I think this is a wonderful space. So before I dial off, and I do apologize for having to leave early, I tell you, I came on the call very tired, and now I am full of energy and passion, and I could stay here for hours. So I do really appreciate that I was invited, and thank you. So before I leave, I just wanted to flag 3 very quick things that I'm kind of flagging in all of the talks that I give. In the legislation, Minister Donnelly announced yesterday that there's some move in his department for this, which is a positive piece of noise, I feel. But if that something does come from that, we are wondering what form it will take. And there's 2 very, very important pieces that we are going to be pushing very hard on. We're going to be pushing hard on 100 meters, because we've spent the last several months pacing out around hospitals and clinics around the country. 50 meters simply is not enough. People can be seen and heard in 50 meters. 100 meters is the minimum. The second thing is that the Northern Irish legislation was opt-in, and we want to make absolutely certain that we don't have an opt-in piece of legislation, because, as we said, with the Catholic ethos, that would be a disaster. It won't solve anything, it won't change anything, so we need it to be a blanket piece of legislation. They're the 2 pieces you'll see us pushing for, and obviously we would love any support that you can give us. The final thing is, and it's to do with ancillary stuff around the legislation, rogue pregnancy agencies, rogue crisis. Yeah. Huge problem in Limerick. I have a circuit that I do on my bike every day, taking down stickers from Gianna Care. They're up, and what they're doing is they're targeting areas around schools, secondary schools. So in the areas that secondary schools come out the signposts, the lampposts are covered with these Gianna Care stickers, as well as the hospitals, the clinics, and so on. So this is becoming a bigger problem, and there are clinics in operation in Limerick, Galway, Kerry, and several other places. We have a legal group in Limerick who have offered to have a little look and see whether there's anything that can be done legally about this, but we haven't got very far on it because we've been really concentrating on the safe access zone piece. So it was just something that is very much ongoing and live in Limerick and other places, and I wanted to flag it. And sorry for jumping in, and thank you for your time, and thank you for including me. I really appreciate it. It's lovely to see you all.
Thanks, Karen. Before you go, a quick 30-second question.
Absolutely.
Is there any role for, I'm a councillor in Wicklow, is there any role for local authorities in establishing bylaws for safe access zones?
No. Now that was the first thing, and it was the only thing that we got an easy answer and a quick answer for, and it was the first question we asked Mairead Enright, because we hoped to go that route. And what Mairead said is that it had been tried in several local councils, and in every case, I think there was 3 different cases where it was brought, the legal team of the executive in the council came back in each case and said that it wasn't going to be possible from a local perspective. We were hoping that we'd be able to copy what happened over in England and in Ealing specifically, but the legal people in all of the councils said absolutely not, and Mairead agreed, and that's why we bypassed that then, and we went straight for legislation.
Perfect, because there's a fellow councillors discussing that in our council at the moment, so it's good to hear that. It's sometimes you have to figure out where to put your energy towards.
Absolutely. One thing that worked for us very well in Limerick, and if it was possible anywhere else, it would be great. We got the council to we laid down a motion asking council to write to Minister Donnelly to ask for immediate safe access zone legislation, and we got unanimous support, which was remarkable considering Limerick Council is not a progressive council, but it was hopeful because
I second this.
what we got back from several of the councillors was they said in full council, and they said that they had voted no in 2018, but that they would support this because they could not allow their constituents to be harassed on their way to medical appointments. So we feel that there is some good grounds and some good hopeful signs, and we felt that piece of work with the motion was well worth doing, and it started a great conversation locally as well, so it was well worth doing, and we'd be delighted to share the wording of the motion that we put in with anybody who wanted to do that.
Brilliant. You can maybe email me, Karen.
I'll send it on. Thank you so much.
Send it to all of us.
Yeah.
Thank you all so much, and for the support. The moral support means the world to us, so we really appreciate it, and thanks for everything.
Keep going.
Thanks, Karen.
Thank you.
Good night.
Karen.
Just to
go on there, Helen. Yeah, back to Janet.
I was going to come back to Janet's thing, and I'm going to say, like, I represent the abortion rights campaign, so like we are very clearly a single issue campaign. Like, it's in the name. That's what we're all about. But like, you're absolutely right, and I think that what we need to do, like, there shouldn't be. I'm in the camp of there shouldn't be legislation just about abortion. Like, it's the only healthcare procedure that is legislated to this extent. We need it post 8 because otherwise we wouldn't get any abortions at all. But ultimately, it's not a goal to keep that legislation in 10 years' time. I don't want it there. Do you know? I want abortion to be legislated to the same extent a kidney transplant is, which is not really. Do you know? There shouldn't be anything specific in there. There needs to be, so that we can get that shift. But the issue is exactly what you're saying, that sort of removing the 8th Amendment didn't get rid of that patriarchal, misogynistic culture in our hospitals, and that's and so on and so forth, and that's why abortion access is so poor in hospitals. So I think that when we're talking about it, we need to go, it's not just because people aren't sure how to do a manual vacuum aspiration. That's not what it is. It's because of these things. We need to, when we're talking about problems with abortion legislation and abortion access, we need to embed them into the fact that this is a cultural issue, or this is a thing. And yes, some of them are really specific to the legislation, but so many of them are embedded in how we think about women's bodies and how we think about things. One of the things I have written down here is changing in the legislation from pregnant people to, from women, excuse me, got that the wrong way around, changing from women to pregnant people. And that's because so that trans people can access abortions without hassle. Not a lot of trans people need abortions. We don't have masses and masses of trans people in the country, but I don't know if any of you saw recently, there was a cis migrant woman whose PPSN number was wrongly assigned to be male, and she was trying to access maternity care under the mother and infant scheme, and she couldn't because it said M next to her name. So she went to the Journal because she was like, someone has to do something. I've been on the phone to the HSC, to everyone else says not my problem, and she just gets sent in a circle. So, you know, there are small things like that where this is affecting lots of issues and lots of people. And that ties, you know, that thing of not putting pregnant people instead of women. Trans healthcare is terrible in this country. Like, this is a bigger issue. These are issues of how we treat people whose bodies don't do the things that the patriarchy has decided they want them to do. And so these issues all tie together. And I think, even speaking as someone who talks about abortion, specifically abortion a lot, and who comes from the abortion rights campaign and will be having a march for choice about abortion, I think we can't just think about abortion in and of itself. We need to think about it as part of this related issues, because they all interweave together. You know, that's the only way we're going to, not the only way we're going to make significant change, but it's the only way we're going to make lasting change. And I think it's also one of the reasons why we do find people aren't or don't know there was an issue is because we're all tired of talking about abortion. We spent a lot of early 2018 doing nothing but talking to every single person we knew about abortion and informing them on facts. We're all tired of it now. Apart from me and Ailbhe, I have to keep doing this. So, you know, everyone else is, you know, done with it in a way, I suppose. So that's my answer to your question. Yes, you're right. We have to keep doing that.
But I think if I could say, Janet, I mean, I agree with you, Helen. It is the kind of perennial activist problem that you have a big picture in your head, you have a vision, you know what you want the society to look like, you know how you want it to function. But in fact, you get tripped up all the time by having to focus on the particular, on the detail. And I mean, I've always said that if we hadn't had the referendum in 1983, we could arguably, possibly have moved ahead a lot sooner on abortion and then, you know, been freed up to do so many other interesting things. At the same time, I do think that there is quite a conversation, and has been now really since repeal and since the cervical cancer issue and scandal, that there is an awareness that really with the whole area of women's health is completely it's completely under-resourced, and that is very, very true of reproductive and maternal health. It is seriously under-resourced, and I do think that there is a very strong argument now for focusing on the development of policy, which is not about legislation, but which is about specifically seeking to resource that area of healthcare. And it's not necessarily a bad time to do it, because there is so much going on about healthcare generally. So that, for example, the move to a single tier health system, whether it's under the guise of Sláinte care or some other modality, which might be even better, I think. I think that will, of course, that would have an immediate impact on women's access to care, particularly for certain groups of women, and that would be hugely helpful. But I do think that it's possible for us to keep pushing on that issue. Sorry, I think there's just something has gone wrong with my screen. Anyway, can you see me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
I hear you and see you. Yeah.
Okay. That we need to keep pushing, and we need. If Minister Donnelly persists in speaking about this matter, he has to be asked very precise questions about not just what he means, but how much. What is the budget for this? What is the resource for this? How is it going to be resourced? Over what period of time? Where is the leadership to implement this? And so on and so forth. So those tough questions need to be put from the political people like yourselves, you know, to keep pushing that. To say it's lovely to have these ideas, but what we need are plans, and we don't need another national strategy on whatever. What we need is a really good plan, which is properly budgeted for beginning to adequately resource even just maternal and reproductive healthcare to start with. That'll cover a whole lot.
And that has been highlighted. The deficiencies in that, I think, have been highlighted again with the pandemic in the past year, like brutally highlighted. And it's just the tip of the iceberg. Yeah.
Highlighted and exacerbated.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, I was at the webinar last night on the women who have been giving birth without their partners being allowed to. I mean, it would absolutely break your heart, but the treatment, many of the women spoke, I don't know if anybody was there, very, very, very powerfully and very movingly. The treatment to which many of those women have been subjected is quite simply brutal. It was cruel, it was brutal, and it was, you know, doctors walking away, having told a woman that she is miscarrying and she has nobody with her to support her, nobody, just walking away, saying you're miscarrying, it's going to happen within the next 6 to 12 hours, out the door. You know, this kind of treatment wouldn't happen if we had properly resourced maternity units, high quality, high class. It just wouldn't happen. So it makes me, I should say anyway, extremely angry to think that, yes, we have had to give all of this time to abortion. I get very mad about that, because we could all have been doing, well, I think 35 years when I could have been doing X, Y, Z and A, B, C, D and E and I don't know what not, that we have had to do this. And the thing is, we've got to keep focused on this, those of us who do it, to make sure that it's a bit better for women, you know, and we need all, you know, everybody else to be shouting about this woman-centered, human rights-centered, equality-centered healthcare system, please.
Exactly. Rosanna, did you want to come in there?
Yeah, just very quickly to answer Janet's question. So one thing that I think is important personally is for political parties to have holistic rounded policy papers on reproductive health. And so we're producing that at the moment in the Green Party. But at the start of the journey that we took to produce this, I carried out a survey of all other political parties in Ireland, all other Green parties abroad, to see what theirs looked like. And I found maybe 1.5 examples. So like, it really is like, there are no rounded, complex policy papers on reproductive health in all of its, you know, various like issues, you know, going right from consent to sex education, to surrogacy, to assisted reproduction, to LGBT rights, like going through all of these, there it is rare as hen's teeth to find any group or any political party who have produced them. So us producing one maybe is going some way towards that. But I think it's important that people do. Oh, and I just have to say, I have to pop off in a minute, so I'll just say thank you now and goodbye. I have another meeting coming up that I need to get ready for. It's been wonderful. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Rosanna. And just as I'm listening to you, I wonder, does the lack of policy papers coming from political parties just reflect the lack of female reps in general in politics? Which segues nicely into NASA. NASA, I just want to bring you in there, because we were talking there a little while ago about, you know, who has the kind of compulsive powers, or where does the HSE come in instructing maternity hospitals to provide services? Can you shed, you're the Green Party health spokesperson, can you shed any light on that from your knowledge of the kind of the workings of the system?
Well, I don't know, can I? I know, I think it's been a really interesting discussion on that particular topic, though, because it does speak to that issue around the wider attitude, you know, across Ireland to women's bodies or people's bodies that don't necessarily do what the patriarchy wants them to do. I think that was you, Helen. Yeah. And I think that is my 3-year-olds in the background, sorry. I think when we're talking, and not to go right back to the start, but Ailbhe was saying that, you know, 2018 was a moment, it was like a step on the road, but like this will be a constant fight. And it does strike me that as much as, you know, I'm very focused on the next few months with the review, I'm also very aware from the last 18 months where we were screaming around the maternity restrictions that we didn't really get where we wanted to go with that, and we're still not there. And you know, Minister Donnelly met the Women's Caucus today, actually at 2 o'clock, and I can tell you it was meant to be, you know, he's on the road at the moment about women's health, and it was meant to be, and in fairness to him, well, we could talk about the safe access zones. Lovey, could you just wait? So he was trying to give us this whole thing about the women's access zones about the women's health more generally. And I have to say about 70% of the women there wanted to talk about maternity restrictions. And eventually what he said was, well, we don't have a world where you can go into a hospital and order the master what to do. And that's the reality. And from his point of view, we don't want a world where you can go in to order the master what to do. But I can see everybody on the Zoom call doing this, by the way. But from my point of view, that bit of nuance and political niceness and diplomacy is costing women and people who are pregnant a huge amount. So I think that as much as like in this review, we could get, let's say we got everything that we wanted and every possible version of it, I still think that we would be, after that process, looking at every single hospital going, oh, you're not doing it. You're not because that patriarchy, that system, it seems, I mean, look, I don't want to be cynical because like we have come a journey with the safe access zones just in the last month. So like change is possible, but at the same time, I think this is just going to be a constant, like we're going to have to be vigilant all the time. And the next round is this review, but it's not the last round by any means possible. So I think the kind of systemic nature of patriarchy in Ireland is going to continue to be a problem. And actually, when we were talking about the conscientious objection, I know like some of the things I was very wary about there is that who does the conscientious objection apply to? Because in its purest form, it's an individual, but we have seen in other jurisdictions where it gets applied to like an institution or a particular group. And then how does the individual conscientious objection operate within a system? So if you have like 5 doctors and all 5 of them are conscientious, you're basically you're not giving a service. So like, it's such a complex area. I'm really super wary of it. And I think, again, not to be cynical, but I think if any country was going to activate that in the wrong way, I think Ireland would.
Yeah.
I just think that we're the type of society that would like work around the law to do exactly what we want, which is to not provide abortion in a lot of instances. So I accept the principle of conscientious objection, but I'm very worried about it being misused in our very closely knit community where we have health staff ringing up protesters to tell them when. I mean, that to me is, I'm still shocked, even though I know that happens. So that, yeah, I guess, look, that all sounds very cynical, and I have to say that, like, you know, in the last month, just to say one thing on the safe access zones, now is the time to tell them that you want 100 meters and you want all the various, whatever it is, because I can tell you that they weren't going to do it. And actually, in a way, even though it really ruined my my holiday down in Lidge, that whole thing during the summer, it at least brought it all out into the open. And I had actually a very good conversation on a corridor with the minister, and there was no position paper, there's no policy paper, they were not doing it. And now they're doing it, but if there's no policy paper, that means that there's no recommendation for 50 meters yet.
Yeah.
So now is the time to say it has to be 100 meters, and I'll be doing that. But so there, it seems to me that it's a blank at the moment, and that's a bad thing, because it means that, like, it'll take a longer process to get there, but it also means that they haven't put any of the bad crap into it yet. And it's similar with the terms of reference, and I know you guys have been in contact with them about that, is that that seems to be further along. And we'll just have to take that as it comes and see where they are with it.
Can you shed any more? I was going to ask you that actually, NASA. Can you shed any more light in terms of the terms of reference, or like, where is it at the moment?
He told us today that it is meant to be obviously the legislation requires that it's commenced at the end of the year, that it's not much more information that you guys already have. They've put their chair in place, and that they are in the preliminary stages. It sounded more like that they had documents flying around and they were drafting things, but there's no sign and there was no date given around the issuing of a terms of reference at all.
But
So
I did hear that the safe access zone, it's hardly a heads of a bill, but something has actually already been in with the AG, with the Attorney General, and come back out to the Minister. Is that right, Nessa? That's what I heard.
I didn't hear that it was a heads of bill. I believe they've had a meeting. They've had a meeting.
Just a meeting.
Yeah, and that now you never know. I mean, the way it was described to me is that there was frustration because the department don't want it, whereas the politicians have agreed it, but the department didn't want it, and therefore there was a kind of a lag, and they decided to move ahead. But that's why there's no policy paper. Usually there'd be a policy paper floating around for a year or two, but that hasn't happened because there was no real intention to do it. That's how I understand it. And of course, with the AG, it'll have to go back and forth. And I know I've also been in contact with some unions, and I'm very mindful of that thing of respecting people's right to protest. I think one of the better arguments that I heard, and I think Mairead Enright described this, but I was also talking to ICCL, is that issue around you have the right to protest, but you don't have the right to protest anyone. And it should be a fair protest. So if you want to change a law, you should be protesting the legislators. So come and protest me. Don't come and protest some poor woman who's accessing care and should be doing it in privacy and in dignity. So I think what I understand is that anywhere it's been challenged, and it's usually always challenged, they win. They win because there's lots of good arguments for safe access zones.
The reason I was asking you, sorry, if I can just go back on that again. I mean, if the Minister has been in with the Attorney General, which he has, he went in with something in his hand. Maybe not, I hear now that very little gets put on paper, apparently, in Dáil. But
I won't comment on that, Ailbhe.
No, but there was a proposal. There was a proposal of some kind that he went in with. And I mean, that's what I would love to know. You know, how far are they on with it?
Okay, well, he hasn't told me any numbers, as in, is it 100 meters or 50 meters? My understanding is that it was a kind of a loose conversation, and the AG set out the process for him, and now that they're going to follow the process, I can chase it up and see if I can find out any more. But I certainly am under the impression that there wasn't a whole lot of body to what they were discussing. It was theoretical.
And the other bit is the free contraception, and is there going to be an age limit on it? Because when it was mooted first, there was this ridiculous proposal that you could get free contraception until you were, 25 or something?
24. There was a report done, and there's like 4 options. And I think one of the options is to do it up to 24. One of the options is to do it for everyone. And there's about 50 million in the difference. I say what we'll be looking at is a phase in, but I think that we'd want to see in the budget the beginning of it, like, you know, if it is truly a phase in, like, I think the language in the programme for government is that you would do a certain cohort as the beginning of a process to bring it in for everybody. And but if we're going to really do that, you'd want to see that starting in 2022. Like, you know, a government's only 5 years, and if we're not going to get on the road in 2022, where are we going? So I'm expecting to see it in the budget in some form. I probably won't be happy with what we get, but like, I'm expecting to see it started.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
And just actually, while we're kind of talking about the broader reproductive and health issues, we have to mention the National Maternity Hospital, I think. And again, somebody was saying earlier about, you know, repeal. We were kind of hoping that this would be kind of the start of sort of centering, you know, women and other people in healthcare and that process. And I know personally, I felt the proposed new National Maternity Hospital would be a sort of like a fresh start for that, from moving away against that very patriarchal consultant-led, you know, process. But instead, we're still mired not knowing what's happening. And again, Ailbhe, I know you'll have tons to say in this, but Nessa, just in case you have to drop off the call, you know, I did read that there is, you know, sort of a change in sort of the legislators' opinion on the pros and cons of the governance in the papers recently. Have you anything to sort of add to that or shed light on? Have they now decided the governance isn't quite all it was cracked up to be, even though we've all been saying it for a long time?
I mean, I can't speak for them. And they possibly wouldn't tell me because I've been so voracious in my criticism of it. Sometimes they don't tell me these things because they don't know what I'm going to do with the answers. I just think that even just from a kind of a like, if you've no interest in the kind of historical context here, just that as a governance thing, building, you know, valuable assets on land you don't own, and you don't really understand, you know, when, you know, like how you're going to retain that asset. It just seems crazy to me. It just seems madness, and it's a kind of like a historical legacy weirdness in Ireland that we just can't seem to get over. That kind of belief in like institutional land is somehow also part of the state, and it's just not. So I have no new information, or see, I would love to think that they've seen the light there. And certainly there was a governance expert on before the summer on one of the morning shows who went through it. He had no interest in the hospital, and he went through all the governance things piece by piece. And I actually recorded at the time because he was so good on, well, this piece of their governance doesn't make sense, and this piece and this piece. And certainly I followed up with some PQs, and I definitely think that they haven't answered the questions in the way that they think they have. So I'd love to see if there's a change there, but I have no new information, I'm afraid.
But that's also very interesting. I'd love to hear that recording. Maybe you'd send us a link. But I think myself, what's really interesting is, and something that some of us have said all along, is that yes, of course, I mean, there is the issue of religion, obviously involved with Vincent's, but really the issues of governance and ownership are absolutely key, whether there was religion ever involved or not. You know, that this absolutely should be, since it's going to be a publicly funded hospital, it needs to be built on publicly owned land, and so on and so forth. And that the governance, once you get rid of Vincent's, the issue of the governance to something, it changes, it becomes something else entirely. And there are still problems, obviously, with the governance of the National Maternity Hospital in any case, as there are with so many of our hospitals. And it's because we have obviously this very peculiar historical system. But I mean, it did seem to me that when that government is now looking, which would include yourselves, is now looking for some way out of just getting stuck in the religious argument, and is going to be focusing much more on expenditure. So there is the Controller General's report, which is being sought at the present time on expenditure, and we now have the HSE Risk Committee who are saying, oh, much too risky, we're not going to own this hospital. So that there are these ways out being sought to ensure that government can, without losing too much faith, move to plan B, which is to site the hospital elsewhere, whether that's Tala or another site which might be more desirable, I don't know. But I mean, I do feel that there is that shift happening. Do you think that's right? I mean, I feel it happening. And
I'm hoping that's happening.
Well, okay.
I'm hoping.
Okay.
Well, I'll be perfectly honest. I thought that they would have just signed off on it already. I thought we might lose this one, and they were going to, you know, bring down the guillotine already on it. So the fact that they haven't makes me more hopeful, and I think that some of the points raised have actually given them food for thought. I kind of was expecting them to move quickly to draw a line under the conversation. And although I'm no friend of Stephen Donnelly, I think in this it's a legacy issue for him that he probably hates anyway. So the fact that they haven't actually done that, I think it has given them pause for thought. So in fairness, I am hopeful.
Yes, well, we have to be hopeful, because I mean, if they start building in Vincent's, I meant what I said a while ago. There will be women who will go to lie under those tractors or land movers or whatever it is they bring in. We will lie down and we won't let them do it. But I think because it's very important for the future of women's health, because it is this kind of symbolic thing, as you were saying, Lord. I mean, it's really important in that whole area. But the other thing to remember, of course, is that it isn't actually a national maternity hospital. It's just a big Dublin maternity hospital. And that it doesn't solve the problems that women elsewhere in the country actually have. So we have to win it, but it doesn't actually solve the problems. And I do worry. It's such a misnomer, National Maternity Hospital. And I think we have to be really very, very careful and think what is needed by all of the national maternity hospitals in Dublin and perhaps nationally. And certainly I've heard medics, gynecologists say that what's really needed in the Dublin area is a high-risk unit where any of the maternity hospitals can actually refer, and that should be co-located. That high-risk unit should be co-located actually in one of the big general hospitals, not necessarily Vincent's, could be anywhere, in any of them. And there are a lot of ways of thinking about this which have got pushed to the side because there has been the dispute about the Vincent's land. And the last point I would make about it is that I think fundamentally this is about money and the ownership of private healthcare in this country. That is the huge driving factor in all of this. And I do believe that it's certainly in there as a major, major, major motivator. No doubt about it. No doubt about it whatsoever. And the kind of money that is available in the private sense coming through the National Maternity Hospital. So, really, it is very complicated.
We'll continue living in hope. We won't all be convening in front of bulldozers in another year's time.
I hope not, but I hope you'll all be there if we have to.
We'll all be there if we have to. We hope we don't have to.
I mean, I don't really want to, but I will.
We will, yeah.
I certainly don't want to.
I've plenty of yoga mats here for padding if we need to lie down. Look, I'm kind of conscious of the time, and just I think we've had a really broad-based discussion, not just on the abortion legislation, but also just that broader piece on kind of reproductive rights and health in general. Just as we kind of come into sort of thinking of wrapping up, and again, anyone from the floor that just, stick your hand up, virtual or otherwise, if you want to come in, but sort of leaving with the question, what can we do, the broader we activists in general, and a sort of the we of the Just Transition Greens group, which is a left feminist group, what can we do now to put pressure on the legislators from whatever position we're in, and also to work with your existing groups to help input into the review and help influence? What call to action can we take?
I mean, I'm going to obviously say you can come to the March for Choice next weekend.
Yes.
On September 25th. Like that's the first thing I'm going to say. But I guess I think you can, we have the March for Choice on the 22nd, and we have our research launch, which is the March is the 25th, and the research launch is on the 22nd. I know Mary already put those links into the chat. But I think part of what we need to do is, in a slightly annoying way, start talking about abortion again, in the sense of making people aware of the fact that it isn't fixed. There were a couple of cases back in, I can't remember if it was March or April, about couples having to travel after diagnoses that they were told were not fatal enough. And I remember in a actively pro-choice discussion group I'm in, that had more or less kind of died down. People were like, but I voted for this. This shouldn't still be happening. And it's like, yes, you did, but it didn't work out the way you thought it would. And I think there's a lot of people who aren't aware that this is still an ongoing issue. But I think that we also have to do that broader piece that Janet was picking up on, and that we've all touched on tonight, is that it's not just about abortion. You can't just think about it in isolation. The reason, we need to think about it in our hospitals. And so keep having those conversations, but also having those conversations in that really broad sense, I suppose, and annoy your elected representatives, as I do with Nessa, who is my elected representative.
Handily enough. Ailbhe.
Oh, sorry. I completely, totally agree with that. I do think that there will be questions about the terms of reference for that review. I've absolutely no doubt. And, it is just brilliant to have the connections with you into the Dáil and in that broader kind of political arena, and to just keep those connections and that communication really open and help one another. I think we just have to all work together on it and try and push that review as hard as we possibly can. And of course, the review will come and there will be recommendations, and then the push will come to make sure that the recommendations, if they're worthwhile, we'll be pushing to have those implemented. So there is a process there. And in the meantime, we have to keep working on the other issues in the health area. And certainly, I'm working on the NMH campaign, and we kind of feel at the moment that we're just waiting to see what's going to happen, but that will come up again. That will come up, and people will be called on, and we just have to keep talking with one another. So, I mean, I really appreciated that you asked me along to this evening. It was really great, very, very interesting, and very good to know, you know, just to cement those relationships a bit and know the faces and be able to ring somebody up. I have lured out Mary's numbers. I think I could just say, hey, did you know we need to get out there, or we need a paper, or we need a whatever. And I think that that's what it's all about, really. So
yeah,
thank you for organising it.
No, and thank you. Does anybody else want to chip in before we finish? We're heading towards the hour and a half mark, and I just wanted to echo that, Ailbhe, particularly just a big thanks to everyone for giving up their time. I know, gosh, it's a full-time job being a sort of a female sometimes, just, you know, through the various protests and activism you have to do, let alone all the rest of it. So really appreciate everybody for giving up their time and coming, and particularly big thanks to Mary for pulling all this together.
Yes.
It wouldn't have happened without her at all. I think it was a really positive discussion, and, you know, seconding there what Ailbhe said, I think the more events we have like this, we're cementing relationships, we're all talking to each other, you know, we're seeing each other almost in real life, and we'll know each other to see at the march next Saturday as well. And again, if we can do anything, you have our numbers. Or if we can organise something, again, similar, to reach out to people. We did reach out to a lot of other organisations as well, but they just couldn't make it this evening. We tried to be as inclusive as possible. It's hard to gather everyone together, but if we can organise anything similar to cement our relationships, just shout. So thank you all for coming and joining and speaking and discussing. Really, really appreciate it.
Okay.
Thanks a million.
Thanks, everyone.
It's lovely to be here.
Always.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Very best of luck
Bye.
with everything. Bye.
And you too. Thanks, Ailbhe.